I would like to invite us to a moment of reflexivity with our good colleague, Professor Jason Potts, who last year, after the conference, came to me and Bo and said, it was fantastic. We're close to the Florence consensus. And Bo and myself were very happy that someone came to say that. And we started to work. So Jason stayed for a few weeks after at the EUI, and we had a session with the young scholars to try to create the bullet points of what could become a consensus. The consensus may not be so much about establishing principles for research and policy making, but more setting out directions for a progression of what we've been doing, right? So, like I said, when I introduced the conference, I think Jason, myself, and Bo were slightly overambitious when we set out to write down the consensus. It's always very hard to write things on paper, but we decided that this second conference would probably give us more substance to reach steps toward this. So I have asked Jason to close, like Alex did last year, with a synthesis of what he feels was said, and Jason's going to explain what he wants to do now. Jason, thanks.
Cool. Thank you, Nicolas. Yeah, so what we started with is the I in DCI obviously stands for initiative. So this is a project that we are engaged in. We're not field building here. We're actually trying to do something specific. And that means that we should be able to measure whether we're making progress or not. We should be able to track whether we're moving toward the goal that we're trying to achieve in the initiative. And we're not building a field, but there's a sense in which what we're trying to do is a little bit field-like. We need some of the accoutrements of a field. We've got a conference. There'll be hopefully another one next year. This is a thing that we're building towards. So fields have conferences where we gather and work moving forward. We have a canon. There's a reading list. There's a set of writings that we believe to be true. And that's important because it helps to bring new members into the community and it helps us to remind us what we're doing. And the other thing that we often have is a handbook or a textbook or some sort of statement of what are the basic principles, the theory, boiled down and presented. Now, at the moment, that's kind of it's sort of in the air at the moment. There's a bunch of readings. There's a sort of folk theorem sort of sense of what we believe to be true. But what I think the next step between that we thought we could easily knock off in a weekend last year, a year later, nowhere. But let's re-up that ambition, and between now and next year is to try and move toward figuring out what that consensus might be, because a consensus is, these are the things that we now know, and then we can move on from that to the next sort of set of challenges. So there's a sort of very practical aspect to what we're doing here. Alex did a magnificent job last year, sort of laying out where we got to a year ago in terms of this pathway from a bunch of mostly economic theory into mostly legal and political practice, and just trying to draw that line forward, and sort of indicating that the challenges that we had there was dealing with complexity, dealing with the need to try and discover these rules that were operational and functional, being able to translate that into actionable objects through lawyers into policymakers. The theory integration was flagged as a significant challenge that we face around what do we mean by dynamic capability, what is a platform, what is an ecosystem, what is dynamic competition, what is open about this. Just a bunch of sort of things that we needed to nail down that we kind of intuitively know that they're important and they matter to this, but what specifically are they when we put them into a particular case. The translation of that into regulatory practices and just how to think about that. And there's a few concepts I'm going to return to now. And Alex had flagged last year, we were discussing the nature of counterfactuals, for instance, as a key part of the story, challenge of dealing with uncertainty. And I rewatched the talk that you gave, and I noticed at the end of it you called for next time it was going to be an 8-day conference so that we could really dig into all of these issues properly. Then, as Nicolas was saying, we had wine and came up with an idea that, no, we've got consensus. This can't be that hard. Let's just write it down. And the idea was that we'll gather in a room, we'll persuade ourselves, and then we'll figure out the truth to persuade others. And I think that's still the ambition, is that we believe there is a there there, trying to get to it and to move that forward. So what I want to do is just recap where that is. So where is the...
Probably in the middle.
All right. Can we move the slides forward? The consensus that we've got so far that we've been working on, there is a document that is circulating. Some of you, I know, have seen it because you've scribbled sort of comments all over it. Was the first thing that occurred was the consensus that we thought we had was in the language of computer science, a rough consensus. It was very, very far from being crisp. But there were clear things that came out, right? So this notion of it is technological change that is driving dynamic competition, and that is an evolutionary process. That this means that firm entry and exit, the destruction, the death of firms and the life of firms is the thing that we're dealing with as a fundamental mechanism. The consumer welfare standard is the North Star that we're working toward. That innovation is something that benefits consumers either directly, consumers like new things, or indirectly, competition sort of brings efficiency benefits, which lowers prices, which consumers enjoy as well. So there's multiple pathways to consumer benefits that we can see there. There's a preference then for innovation over efficiency. It's not instead of, it's as well as, but emphasis on that. A general agreement that this is economics and not something else. Again, there's a sort of platitudinousness about this, but the whole point of principles is that you state the obvious things. The less obvious one is that this is firm-centered, not market-centered. And in the sense that what is the object we are trying to observe is a firm and its insides, rather than a market. And again, that's far from a straightforward and plain statement. We can argue about that for days. But the implication there was to pay attention to what's going on in firms is the hard thing that the theory was pointing toward. To evaluate sort of future innovation, these capabilities, these objects are hard to observe, and then we need new rules and measures. Enforcement needs to be forward-looking. So that was sort of where we got to last time. Can we move that forward? There we go. All right, we can break this down into a series of axioms that we're trying to achieve, and again, this is what we'll be working toward, sort of laying this out. There's a bunch of sort of principles in economics, which, as mentioned, principles that guide us from there into law and policy, and there's a research program associated with this. There are things that are unclear, there is things we need to know more about. There is models that we can imagine that don't yet exist. There are models that exist that we need to adapt into the space. So there is work to do in this process. And there was a sense that most of that work needs to be done by economists, but they can't do it alone. There's a sequence of tasks that move along this schedule before we deliver the thing to better policy. All right, so that's where we got to. What do we do this time? You've all been in the same room I have. We've seen the same thing. Like we've dug into this more. So I think there's nothing sort of radically new that's emerged. What has emerged is that these issues are hard, and they're hard in very specific ways. When we dig into this idea that capabilities matter because innovation shapes competition, because consumer welfare matters. That's economics leads us to that. Dynamic competition is important because the economy has evolved. And this is another point, I think it was in everyone's discussion, but we just need to remind ourselves. The reason that we are having this hard new discussion is because the economy is not the one that we had 30 years ago, 50 years ago. It is way more platformy, it is way more digital. This is creating much more complexity, and that complexity is real. and therefore this is not a thing that the world has changed, therefore we find ourselves here having this discussion. That then becomes a law and policy problem because we care about progress. We care about making policy better. And if the world has changed and our policy doesn't fit, then we need to work backwards to figure out how to solve that problem. So this is the sort of, again, not stating anything that anyone doesn't know, but just to reflect on this is hard because it is a hard problem. It is a hard problem because we've never had an economy so complex. Tomorrow it'll be even more complex, and the sort of legal and policy, the gap between sort of idealized policy and actual world is drawing apart. So I want to dig into a comment about that, but before we move to that, the practical details of what we're doing is between now and the next time we meet, to do this again, to dig further into this. The initiative part of this is that we are moving towards trying to solve a problem, to sort of apply theory to the world and make it better. So we need more discussion of this. That's what we're doing here. We need more data to feed into this. There's a research program associated with this. We just need more and more and more of that. But the specific task that I ask for your help with is we also need to do, there's a particular reduction that we need to make, which is to try and figure out the foundational elements of what we're doing, which is exactly what is it that we have reached agreement on so that we can move forward from that. So the proposal is that this will be some kind of living document. Imagine it as something on archive that will circulate and we can update it every time we have a new thought about it. It may eventually get published somewhere as a thing, but my mental model for this is it's the sort of introduction of a handbook that we're writing. And what that will look like is definitions of our terms. We tried to do that and immediately ran into the problem that was hard. The canonical literature and analysis of that's what handbooks and textbooks do, is they sort of gather and reduce that down. The presentation of the core logic and models and analysis, and again, we're not there yet, but there's a belief that is a solvable problem. Then the translation logic of how we then turn those theories into models, into prescriptions, into policy, into judgments, into rulings about that thing cannot make that transaction with that thing, practice. All of that, I think we're relatively, we can move toward. My substantive comment to this is I think there's one thing missing from all of this, and that's, for want of a better phrase, I'll just call worldview. I don't think we have agreement about worldview, about what actually is it that this whole thing is. So, can you try forward? Oh, there we go. All right. First point. When I sort of first got involved, I'm not a law or antitrust or law and economics person. I'm an evolutionary economist. And this was the most obvious thing in the world to me when Thibaut and Nicolas explained it to me, can you come and help with this? Because dynamic capabilities are completely, utterly, trivially obvious to evolutionary economists. They're the thing that everything is made of. They're the genes. The idea of arguing about whether they exist is absurd, because that's the thing that everything is made of. This idea that there is a dynamic capability that enables firms to survive an evolutionary environment that must exist. If it doesn't exist, something is then big chunks of economics are wrong. So evolutionary economists, and there's the Schumpeterian inside, it's a Penrose inside, it's a George Richardson inside, it's a Sidney Winter inside. Gradually it's gone through, and as it's moved on, and then sort of through Tiss's work and others, the evolutionary part has kind of dropped out a little bit, and we sort of sometimes forget that that's what it is. That's the worldview that economies evolve. That anything that lives in an evolving economy has to have these capabilities to live in an evolving economy, and we care, they exist and they're important. Can we measure them? That's the problem, because evolutionary economists have never cared about that, because they obviously exist. They must be there. The fact that they're hard to see is who cares? Turns out we care, because we need to be able to see them in order to do the next sort of process. So that's sort of, I think, just that first notion that there is a sort of, there's a foundation there that sometimes we need to remind ourselves is there. The idea of, the thing about evolutionary economists is that they don't really care much about competition policy, just innovation policy or industry policy. And the reason for that is this foundational belief that innovation policy is competition policy. Again, what we're doing is running it the other way here. The next thing I'll point out is a word that I've heard that I think is misleading us, is the word long run. Long run is a Marshallian word referring to adjustment to equilibrium. Once all of the adjustment processes have happened, we arrive at the thing. We don't mean it like that. We mean long run in the Schumpeterian sense of new state of the world. Thing that it's not a sort of Keynesian long run or Marshallian long run. It's long run in the sense of futural. And I think that this mental shift from, we're not describing, I mean, I know we have to sort of transition from where we are now to the future. But fundamentally, the reason we care about dynamic capabilities is because of the evolution of the economy, the evolvability of that. And our framing should be, I think, futural in the sense of, this is why counterfactuals kick in. Counterfactuals are how you think about the future, not about how you think about the long run. An alternative pathway that could exist or might exist or whatever. And our question is, how do we get to that future state? That's the analysis of counterfactuals. The theory that I think is relevant here is the work of quantum information physicist David Deutsch or moral philosopher Derek Parfit in terms of future persons, future markets, future innovation, counterfactuals, constructive theory. Like there's a whole body of literature. It's just not in economics or law or policy. It's in moral philosophy and information theory and physics. But there are frameworks for dealing with this notion of how do we think clearly about the future in terms of an analytic framework. So I just want to plant that particular flag there. I think this is we're sort of handicapping ourselves by not thinking explicitly in terms of future. The other one is complexity. That's obviously a thing that's come up. But again, there's a lot more there that we could do. I'm a huge fan of Cal Friston's work on sort of Bayesian mechanics. There's lots of analytic frameworks for thinking about how we deal with very, very complex, how complex objects live in complex environments. And there's a world beyond just sort of network analysis and evolutionary theory to deal with that. The other sort of thing I will float is that I think we're also not being ambitious enough around platforms and ecosystems and so on. What we're fundamentally talking about is the governance and design of new economies. And what is new in the world is that we're able to spin up little private economies that have rules and enforcement and boundaries and so on. And those things are now relatively cheap to do, and AI drives us further down that pathway. But that notion of being able to cheaply spin up not a market, but an economy, in the sense that it's got its own property rights, mechanisms, and other things in it. All of our discussion of platforms and ecosystems and so on is as I think will be subsumed by sort of a broader concept of just dynamics of economies per se. So I think there's a more general framework we can move towards. I'll close with one final point on this, which is that I think we've got two pathways forward. There's the pathway we are on, and I'll call this the integrative view. And that's where we try and go from statics to dynamics and integrate them. That's standard move in physics, in mechanics to do that. The strategy that we have chosen to do that is to integrate with price theory and I/O and institutional economics, and to sort of move from static models to dynamic models in that. There's a bunch of sort of ideas that I think we're still not exploring enough in there around sort of how we think of this in terms of bounded rationality and the like. But let me finish with just a a more radical view on this. The radical view is that the integrative view is wrong, and that it's a stepping stone toward the actual truth, which is that dynamic competition is completely futural. Everything we care about lies in the future. The benefits that will come do not yet exist. They are in the future. The people who will experience those benefits do not yet exist. They are in the future. Now, we've sort of hedged that by going 3 years, 5 years, whatever, but let's just future. And once you frame it like that and just say explicitly that word, all of the benefits are in the future, none of the benefits are in the present, you realize the problem. The problem is there is no constituency right now for it. Everything we do does not have a constituency, because all of the constituents are in the future, which is why it is hard, which is why it is politically hard, which is why it is hard. Nevertheless, the entire purpose of this organization is to act in spite of that. And why do we do that? Because of a belief about what lies in the future. What is this most like? This is exactly how global warming climate change policy works as well. That is exactly the same logic, is that there is phenomena in the future, there are people in the future that we need to act now, pay a price, act under uncertainty in order to benefit that. And when you frame it like that, what it does is it shifts where the argument finally comes to rest. The problem is that, and this is the Derek Parfit point, fundamentally we are making a moral judgment that the reason to act is because we want to improve the lives of the future people, and that is we're using economic reasoning to support that argument, we're using legal reasoning to implement it, we're using policy to rationalize it, but fundamentally this isn't a sort of a simple utilitarian argument. This is fundamentally an argument about future lives and future benefits and future innovation and future markets, which gives us a clue as to what we should be measuring. The actual thing we want to measure is future markets. What markets do not exist now but could exist in the future, and that's the sort of welfare criteria. Now that's the problem with that is that's now we've spilled outside of economics and law into moral philosophy. No one wants that. Nevertheless, I think that's where we will find ourselves. So look, I put that there as a closing comment about where I think we're going next, but we're a long way from that now. Let's stop there.
Thank you, Jason. So I think Jason deserves a round of applause for putting this together. Maybe we can collect a few remarks because we still have 10 minutes. But so one thing that I really like into this is, so you insist on a sort of method, like work on definitions, work on assembling the literature, maybe try to build the beginning of a handbook. But also I think what is productive in especially the last points you made about thinking about maybe a moral grounding for this is, this could create a broad tent for all of us to come together, where, like I said earlier, this discussion has essentially been answered by increased politicization. And I think a lot of people around the table here will agree with me that this has been a pretty dispiriting set of years that we've been living through in the antitrust and innovation policy field, where people end up throwing plates at each other because they accuse each other of having the wrong political view. The choice of the particular moral philosophy is something on which we can discuss. The group might have the futuristic ideal as a moral grounding that you refer to. Others, and maybe lawyers, I would count myself in this, also I certainly share this, but as a more Pierce type pragmatic person that feel that something is going on in the world that the cases and solutions that we have, the tools we have, do not provide good answers to, and you want to solve this. But I think this idea of trying to have a broader moral focal points to which we can all, regardless of our political preferences, adhere to, is a very productive step forward. So, Jason, I think that was really, really amazing. So I don't want to talk too much. Maybe there are questions around the table. This is an academic conference, right? So hence we end up with pretty academic content. Are there remarks, things on which you want to come in? Richard.
Thanks for a very interesting summary. I'm going to take issue with one thing, and you're probably going to say that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And what I take issue is, I'm a big fan of Joseph Schumpeter, and a real big fan of creative destruction. I don't see how it fits into competition policy. And for the following reasons, so let me explain. If you believe that creative destruction is an exogenous process, a random exogenous process, it's part of the environment in which we exist. And it's a good thing, but it's just part of the environment. So the real question is, how does what we do in the present affect the likelihood of creative destruction in the future? That is, is there conduct or structure or whatever that either accelerates creative destruction or delays creative destruction? Now, a problem I have is it's easier for me to think of conduct and structure that delays creative destruction than it is to find conduct that accelerates it, which is one of the reasons why I think that policy, antitrust policy in the present, is very important for how we think about the future.
Well, there is a good reason why this initiative is not called the Schumpeterian initiative. And others have tried this, but I think Schumpeter himself had very mixed views about how the economy should be governed, even though he had very insightful and profound conceptions. So this is a very valid point, Richard. Thanks for volunteering to make remarks here. Any other remark? Fred, I know you wanted to say something.
Yes. The question is, what is the purpose of this synthesis? I see operationalized, so I take it that what we are aiming at is not only building a consensus, but a consensus that can convince stakeholders. Now, so I like a lot of the framework, but there are two, three things that I wanted to mention. At some point, we say agencies must keep up. There's only one way to demonstrate that agencies may keep up, is by following what Richard said, empirical proof that this is going back to cases, showing that decisions, competition decisions, have either in certain cases accelerated innovation, in other cases have eliminated the possibility of innovation. Because as long as we do that, if we don't do that, nobody's going to do that. I mean, we'll have a consensus among ourselves, but this is not going to convince anyone. My second point is there's a chapter on complexity. I fully recognize that what we're looking at is something that, if it exists, is complex. I question the value of putting forth the fact that it is complex, except to scare people away. I think it's a red flag. Any enforcers are going to say, oh, it's complex, so I don't want to look at it, or this is a bunch of dreamers. And okay. So, I mean, there it's more a question of presentation, but I do think that if the object is to operationalize what we've been trying to say, there may be a better presentation than this. This is what I wanted to say. For the rest of it,
Thank you very much, Fred. That's very helpful. Just one point. So, the proof of, the feeling that there is something we don't get, right? But the proof may be in the cases, and looking at the cases in the past, like Ariel was, doing with the breakup, and looking at, so getting the cases to talk in the past about what was wrong, what was right, and converging on indicators of performance of good and bad is probably what we need to do in the next months. But maybe this could be one thing we do at the conference next year. But this will require an 8 days conference, certainly, and a lot of wine. Yes, Minka.
Thank you very much. So I'm just wondering, there seems to be, this is something along what I've been thinking about, there seems to be an evolutionary quality to markets. And then if we take the creative destruction as an exogenous process, then ultimately there is no need for competition policy. So is this a dead end?
Well, I would say that my impression would be that the importance compared to last year's conference, there was a lot of talking this year about capabilities. There's these things in the firms, right? And that goes to the points made by Paul Römer and stuff about the fact that innovation is endogenous and creative destruction, may be, endogenous. And so studying capabilities is what is going to help us understand how endogenous creative destruction is compared to, sort of metaphysical belief that creative destruction will fall from heaven. And I think that gives actually a lot of traction for competition and innovation policy, because as you start to endogenize and understand the endogeneity of the process of creative destruction, you start to have mechanisms to slow it or delay it as your choice model dictates you should be doing. So that's my understanding of what we've been discussing.
Yeah, I would just add that, antitrust is endogenous selection. It's a selection mechanism that's working to shape which transactions can and cannot happen. It's doing it on a fairly large scale, but it's part of the selection process. So in the same way you've got natural selection and artificial selection in biology, we've got market selection, and then we've got this artificial selection we call antitrust. And markets are complex information processing mechanisms that we don't quite know how they do the thing that they do, in the sense that they're complex computational processes. And what we're wrestling with here is just this new artificial selection mechanism we've got called antitrust is getting very complex. And at some point we either have to radically simplify it, that's the desire to try and find simple rules, or we have to lean into the fact that this is going to get worse, and at some point we have to hand it over to machines that can, or to objects that can process enormous amounts of complexity. And when that happens, we have, we have, but this idea, we've skirted around the issue a little bit today, around at what point do judges and lawyers and other professional decision makers compete with LLMs and foundation models and so on. But on that list is competition policy, is antitrust. At some point, the option will present itself just to hand it over to a well-trained model that's trained on everything that we can see. And when we do that, it may well work. It may well work amazingly, but we will never know. We will never be able to interrogate it and understand why it did the thing. So this is the trade-off we basically face, is on one dimension we have competition, antitrust that we can explain to ourselves and to people that are our clients, and it will get increasingly bad because the world becomes increasingly complex. And on the other axis we've got a world where ever more intelligent machines will do the thing, and they may well do it better than we could ever do it, but the trade-off is visibility. We can't, and when we lose sight of that, the risk is legitimacy. We lose sight of the legitimacy of the act, and that's the narrow corridor we're walking right now, is where we are on that.
Wolfgang.
Yeah, Jason, Many thanks. This was a great summary, and I liked certain things very well, especially also that you brought in very explicitly evolutionary economics and evolutionary learning. Also, this learning aspect, I think, is very important. And the other, you also brought in explicitly institutions. So the institutional side of all of this, I think this is also very important what we have to do. What you also brought in, you brought in it also, and I think we are a bit in a problem that on one side we pretend that we do competition policy. On the other hand, if we talk about evolution, innovation, then we are much, much broader, and not only competition policy. Yeah, and so this is a bit what we have to deal with that. Yeah, because the selection, for example, of innovation can be dependent on many other kind of laws. Yeah, and so in that respect, I think this is an important problem we have. So this is narrow focus on antitrust, and when we want to be so broad with dynamic competition, and I agree this is very, very important to do so. Yeah, and so this is my main point, but I like very much your broadening of this. Yeah.
Okay, any other? Okay, yeah, I see someone there.
Hi, so Jason, you mentioned, well, we've mentioned dynamic capabilities a lot and how they're perhaps a little bit hard to measure. But then you talked about long-term consumer welfare and the future orientation. My question is quite simple, I guess. How do we measure something that doesn't yet exist?
You don't. The relevant framework here, and this is I think this is the David Deutsch sort of view of the universe, is that the standard sort of mechanics approach is initial conditions and laws of motion, and dynamics is when you run that through and try and predict where the particle is going. Right? That's what we're trying to do. The other way to do physics is to specify, and this is counterfactual, is to specify the laws of physics, or in this case the laws of economics, just all of the things that are impossible. And the fundamental question is just how can we, how do we move through that, what are then the conditions on what is possible to achieve? And you work backwards from that. And any sort of sense, I mean, that's the extreme version of that, but just that anything that is not prohibited by the laws of economics and the laws of physics is possible. And that's the criteria that we're trying to build frameworks around and analysis of. What that does in practical terms is it changes the question around how do we maximize freedom, or how do we maximize opportunity, or how do we maximize the possible space of markets that could exist in the future, or the possible choice set. And it's not a question of, what is the utility of this agent at t+7. It's a question of how do we maximize the space in which that agent would live. So I think this is the hard decision to make, is that whether we're just doing advanced dynamics, where a problem is to try and model the path from initial conditions through better understanding of the laws of motion, or whether we're fundamentally changing the question to trying to maximize this possible space of the future. And that's not something that we, that's not modern economics or modern physics, but it is that's moral philosophy, I think, is the approach there.
Ayel.
Laws of motion are determined by what people do, and what people do are determined by their information sets. And so, it's not what you're saying, if you put it back, and it's just what we're doing. There's nothing different. There is this issue. I mean, there's all the issues of, policy stay exactly the same, because you do a policy to change what people do. What people do determines, where you are and the dynamics of the solution. So, I mean, it's not, this is not a different view than what everybody here has.
Okay. All right. So I think I'm going to close here, I need to say a few things. Oh, no, Mark, okay. Mark, and then we close, because I think wine is waiting, and lots of us would probably like to indulge in something liquid.
I will be fast. Two points on the long term. I think that it's going to be very difficult to speak about competition policy without taking into account the big challenge that we are going to have with climate change and the policy of climate change. And I think that was not discussed here, but that is a very big challenge for competition policy. The second point is just, I did not see during these two days a lot of conflict among us, a lot of fight, I would say. Usually when we look for a consensus, it's because there are fights. So what are these consensus? You try to define what will be the element of the consensus, but I think that the real question is with whom there is a consensus to do.
Okay, thank you, Mark. That's a very good point. And I mean, we've been observing lots of fights outside and on certain types of platforms, and some people are real fighters, I can tell you. I think actually this is what I wanted to say here. I think the way we've been thinking about this is, we like to agree to disagree, and we can do that in civil ways, and we can do that regardless of our politics and our fields. We may disagree on things like methods and morals, but we are optimistic that we can find some common ground. And so, I think that this diversity can be felt in the room here. You've got people more from the evolutionary economics tradition, people more from the IO, empirical, theoretical tradition, people from the complexity, agent-based modeling type of approaches. And I don't hear anyone here say that any of these methods is wrong on its own terms. I think there's an interest in knowing from others what they have been doing. Okay, but let me just say something. So we are trying to build a broad tent here, or a broad church, as this place invites as a better analogy. We had, that initially my plan, Carl, I can confirm this, was to go up there and open the conference from the chair. And I didn't do it because I didn't want people to end up with a massive back pain trying to watch over. But it is the broad church that we are trying to build here. And that broad church requires participation, to your point, Mark, of people in public policy, of private practitioners, lawyers, economic consultants, academics, technology people, without name calling. This is the ground rule, and we want to create a bigger group. So, please help us. And I take it as a good sign that there was no fight during the conference, because there was disagreement and differences in perspectives, but there was no fight, and I find that pretty good. You don't lay your hands on the priest. We learned that. Okay, so let me just say a few other things. So I think also this conference has been, to me, characterized by a call for humility. I think lots of people here have views about the world, but we all came to the table saying, well, I should not say it's deep, it's complex. No, I think a lot of people said, it's actually pretty difficult to describe what's going on in the real world, right? This is the role of a university. Describe what's going on in the world. And I think we are all in agreement that it's fairly hard, and we've been coming to this discussion with humility, and I think that's good. We'll also come to this discussion with optimism, as you were saying, we think we can make progress, and we'll keep doing this. What is the question? What are we trying to achieve here? I think all this stuff about dynamic competition is more an aspiration than anything else. So yeah, on behalf of David Thies, my colleague and friend Bo Hayden, who could not be here for family reasons, and myself, I want to really thank all of you from the bottom of our hearts for coming to Florence and engaging in these discussions, which may sometimes feel a little bit disoriented, but are grounded in, I think, a common belief that we can improve and we do not hold all the answers. I need to say a special thanks to Ariana Morel and Alice Pinesci from the Law Department, who came for these 2 days to help and also assisted in the preparation of the conference. I want to give a shout out to the young scholars of the Dynamic Competition Initiative that you have seen in the room. They've also helped with the interviews. They are working on their PhDs. A PhD is lonely and hard, so for them it was very nice to meet a group of people that operates outside of the hills of Florence and have discussions. They've been doing some great work these past few days, so I think they deserve to be credited for this. I need to say, on behalf again of Bo, David, and myself, a big thank you to Carla. And I've been thinking about what to say, but as a lawyer, I would advise myself to put a massive non-compete clause in my contract with Carla, because she must not go anywhere else and stay. As a colleague and friends, I've been thinking that if I could play basketball like Bo Hayden, I'd like to have Carla in my team. If I could dance like Carla did in a previous career, I'd like to have her as an instructor. I'm a very poor dancer. And if I had her as a tennis player, I would not like to play against her. I'm a tennis player. And I would not like to, maybe I would like to play with you, so you help me raise my game. So a big round of applause to Carla for the great. Thank you. Okay, one last word. There is a tendency in the academy to believe that helicopter money is just here and waiting to land on the desks of PhD researchers, and money is something that is just made from heaven, and these events can run just if you decide to have an event. This is not the real world. The real world needs investment and financial support. And we are very grateful to our event sponsors, Cornerstone, CRA, and RBB Economics, for helping us starting to build the big tent here in Florence. So thanks to our sponsors for the support. And I'm sure that the people that had views about the sponsoring through private sector money from conferences and possible biases will have enormous doubts about the solidity of that correlation. So I want to thank them again, and we'll be in touch with more activity in the next weeks and months. There will be a third annual conference. This is a very strong and credible commitment. Thank you very much.
And Nicolas, thank you for keeping the doors open to a very large tent and for everything you've done here.